welcome back to Trials and Tribulations. It's been a little while since we've recorded a podcast, and that's just, life gets a hold of you and we get busy, but we want to get back into it and discuss some important topics, and something motivated us to get back on camera today, and that is a combination of a couple of factors. First, discussing Level Insurance, where we are with Level Insurance for all of our current customers and why Level Insurance is currently not being sold. And then really a reaction to a recent article and also LinkedIn post from somebody who appears to be somewhat prominent in the insurance industry, talking very negatively about both legal finance and legal insurance as having some sort of negative causal impact on litigation, on cost of premiums and things like that. And we want to dispel some of those, I guess, improper statements that are being made, factual inaccuracies, and talk a little bit about some of the benefits of leveling the playing field, both for our clients and really for society in general.
Yeah, and I think this is not something new. This is just a new ways of articulating the same theme that we've discussed on several of our podcasts, as far as how certain factions have been much more effective at communicating things to the general public about litigation, and it's usually with an anti-plaintiff's lawyer message. In discussing some of these things before we came on today, we recognize that a lot of these new catchwords that are being used, which we're going to discuss today, is just the same thing being said differently. And these things start to stick and they hold. And again, they're very good. Certain factions are very good, much more effective at communicating. And I think that's part of what we're trying to do here, is dispel some of these things, break them down, and to knock some of these things out from underneath them to show that it's really misleading in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and for you and I, we developed Level Insurance. It was the first ever insurance product for plaintiff lawyers to protect themselves in the event that they lost their case. Because plaintiff lawyers, they put out a lot of their own money. Defense has a huge war chest. They have tons of money, tons of capital to fight the most legitimate lawsuits out there. And they do, whether the lawsuit involves the death of a child, paraplegia, terrible outcomes for everyday people. The defense has a lot of money to beat those claims back, and both on the individual case basis and then on a grander scale by making litigation as a whole sound somewhat frivolous, opportunistic, driven by plaintiff lawyers, when all of those statements are false, but they've stuck so well in the public through the media. And with our product in particular, we were trying to level the playing field for plaintiff lawyers to give them some access to risk mitigation that everybody else already has. And like everything else, it's been mislabeled and shown to be some sort of a problem as opposed to a solution.
Let me unpack a little bit what you said, and let's talk about the playing field. We've always, that was our motto, that was our trademark, so to speak, was our insurance product levels the playing field. Before we get into this, let's discuss what is that playing field. Let's break that down, because it's very important for everybody to understand what the playing field is in general, what we're talking about when we use the term playing field, and to look at it oversimplistically perhaps, but you have people, you have large corporations, and then you have insurance companies that sit somewhere in that environment. Then obviously you have the justice system, right? And then sitting on top of all of that, you have compliance and regulation and laws. So all of these things intersect. And at the end of the day, there has to be some sort of mechanism to hold people and or companies responsible for their conduct that harms people. I think anybody can agree that there must be some system in place to keep people and to keep companies accountable and responsible, and to hold them accountable for anything from simple negligence to even worse, fraud or intentional recklessness, intentional misconduct. There has to be some way of regulating it. So everyone can agree upon that. And I think therein lies some differences that people somehow overlook the necessity to have some sort of regulating mechanism in place. So what do you think about that?
You're right. Holding people accountable and corporations accountable for their bad acts is very important to make sure that people are well protected. Because, naturally, and there's nothing wrong with this, we're not saying this negatively, but companies are profit driven. They're driven to return money to their shareholders. They're driven to earn a profit, to make money. They're not there necessarily to be charitable. But in doing the things that they do, oftentimes they can end up causing harm to other people, either through mismanagement, bad research. They could have a product that's defective. They may have an employee that does something bad to another person that's their customer. All these things affect the regular everyday person, and that person's only recourse oftentimes is to file a lawsuit so that they can get compensated for the harm that's been caused to them. And that, if you think about it in very plain terms, that sounds very reasonable. But what has happened over the course of the last 20, 30 years as words like tort reform, or what was the other word that we recently...
New one's social inflation. That seems to be the new buzzword, which is essentially the same crap packaged into a different catchphrase that's sticky.
Right. So inflation's bad, right? Everybody knows inflation's bad. So social inflation is when insurance companies' claim history, our claims costs exceed the regular inflation that we're seeing in this country. So now insurance companies are arguing that they are subjected to social inflation. But in truth, what's happening here is all these words are being used to make the everyday person believe that tort reform is the answer. And what is tort reform? Tort reform is when you limit people's rights to access to the courtroom. You limit their rights to damages. You limit their rights to claim.
No, there's a whole host of things that have been done under the guise of tort reform, and it's pretty obvious once you analyze them, the net losers and the net winners.
And so what happens is plaintiff lawyers are looked at as the boogeyman. They're the big bad wolf that's coming in to file tons of frivolous claims, make all of your insurance premiums go up, and ruin your lives. Of course, all that is total garbage. It's total nonsense. And all the research, everything that you would see shows that that is not true. Insurance companies are making money hand over fist. Their profits are only going up. Yet every time they have an opportunity to try to make plaintiff lawyers look like they are causing the societal harm, they do so. Why? So that they can increase their profits, limit their responsibilities to everyday people, and make it impossible for people to get justice. And that we're seeing more and more of that. And then as the internet and things like LinkedIn or Instagram or social media are used to create viral statements that support these types of positions, it makes it even worse.
Yeah, it's a constant theme that we've been addressing, and it's reared its head now. Specifically, what we're going to talk about today is the intersection between insurance, litigation finance, and the courts, and how that's playing out. And again, I think within the context of holding people and holding companies accountable for causing harm. And I think it's useful to discuss alternative arrangements, right? I think the United States has a very unique system and a unique balance for holding people and companies accountable for harm that they cause. And the plaintiff's lawyer and the contingency fee agreement and that structure is really critical to keeping that balance in the United States and for to impose accountability and consequences for bad actions. If we look at alternative arrangements, and even here in the United States, let's look at, for example, the banking sector. Extremely highly regulated, and there's a lot of costs associated with that. So if a bank does something wrong, the government regulator that's dedicated to regulating that particular industry is going to go in and presumably punish wrongdoers and provide some sort of redress to any customers or consumers that have been harmed. That in and of itself has all sorts of additional costs and complexity embedded there, but somehow in the course of our country, that's been decided that particular industry should be highly regulated with dedicated government agencies and the likes, right? So it's important when we talk about these systems in the United States in particular, and we can look at other countries the way they handle these things. No matter what, if you're going to hold somebody or a company accountable, there will be costs and effort associated with that. For example, a bank has to have a whole compliance department. They're going to have many, many times more employees dedicated just to that particular function than, say, an unregulated industry would have. But if you're in an unregulated industry, who's the ultimate regulator?
It's the court system, right. And it's the lawyers. And I guess because I've been a plaintiff's lawyer for so long, and it's in my DNA, and I understand the way the system works, that the false statements that are made to try to limit people's rights, they bother me personally. And so when I think about things that are said about both insurance for litigation for plaintiffs as well as financing for plaintiffs, it really hits me hard to think about all the inaccuracies and false statements that are being said to try to harm that industry. Because what ultimately happens, Larry, is when it is successful, when there is success in harming the litigation finance industry or the litigation insurance industry, the loser is the person who needs the help from the lawyer. I could tell you, I cannot remember how many times, and it wasn't a small amount, it was a larger amount of times, when I would sit down with a potential client who had been aggrieved, and some element of their case blocked them from being able to file a lawsuit. Some type of tort reform, whether it was, they didn't have the right survivor, or there was damage limitations, or the defendant didn't have any insurance, something would make it so I could not take their case. And they would look at me and they would tell me that they were in favor of all of these laws that limited the rights of people because they thought, prior to themselves being harmed, that lawyers were the problem. They only realize that this is really a problem for them or for people like them when it actually happens to them. But the problem is there's no scale there. Each individual person that comes to this realization is only one person that now tips in favor of free access to the courts, whereas the masses are fed all this nonsense through the media to make lawyers on the plaintiff's side look terrible so that people in general, when they go to vote or when they're making laws, think it's right to limit the regular person's access to courts.
And when I've thought about this, I think that we can use two words to really highlight the false premise that all of this is built upon. And the two words are frivolous, and the other word is lawsuit. Those two words, frivolous, lawsuit, that is probably the most effective messaging that those who have had a legislative agenda to try to limit the rights of plaintiffs, those two words, I think, have been the most powerful. If you think about this, the average person on the street, has that person ever used the word frivolous in any other context? Do most people even know what frivolous really means? Obviously not. The second thing is the notion that a frivolous lawsuit can actually survive in our court systems. I think non-lawyers don't totally understand that. But a lawsuit that completely lacks merit, whether it's in a state court, federal court, doesn't get very far ever. And there's consequences for any lawyer or plaintiff that brings a frivolous lawsuit. So those things are self-regulating. But once you attack the notion that these lawsuits are being filed are without merit, everything else on top of it collapses. And I think that that's such an important thing to talk about and to analyze here, because all of these arguments that are made by large insurers, by large corporate interests that are lobbying to have these tort reform changes made, they all beat to the drum of this notion of a frivolous lawsuit, and that there's an avalanche of baseless, meritless claims being made, and that is the cause of rising costs, rising insurance premiums, and the like. And I think that that's preposterous, and it's an impossible notion to defend.
And rising insurance costs, rising insurance premiums, who's actually analyzing what's causing that and what the result of that is? And what I mean by that is if you look just at the Dow Jones or the S&P, and you look at the profit that insurance companies that are publicly traded are making and have made over the course of the last 2, 5, 10 years, they're making huge sums of money. They are returning dividends to their shareholders. Their stock prices continue to go up. So it's not as if they are suffering some catastrophe from an onslaught of frivolous litigation.
And maybe if there are catastrophes, natural catastrophes, that's a whole other topic.
That's what insurance companies have they've decided to take on that risk.
The increase in the incidences of natural disasters, the increase in the severity of those disasters caused by pollution and by environmental changes, that's a whole other topic. And that's a legitimate topic, but what I think is happening is that there are a lot of interests that are trying to conflate those sorts of things and hide behind those and use other things like frivolous lawsuits as a reason why premiums and other things are being increased, far more than they probably have to. And the day after day, the plaintiff's lawyer is the target. It's the plaintiff's lawyer is the patsy, and it's almost a diversion that's been used for decades now. And I think it's something that we have to continue to push against, not only in what we do professionally, but in these sorts of conversations that hopefully resonate with people.
Well, I also it's partly I want to send a message to the people that continue to drive this agenda of quote unquote tort reform and frivolous litigation and increased insurance premiums because of the big bad plaintiff lawyer. Attempts to stop litigation finance and litigation insurance, they're going to fail. There's been decades now where the people who have the agenda to try to stop lawsuits from being filed, to try to harm people's rights to have access to the courts, has been extremely successful. Starting with Karl Rove, I think he coined the phrase tort reform. And the success rate from that, from the hot coffee case at McDonald's, which everybody's been brainwashed to think was some terrible case, and on, people have been sort of programmed to think that anything involving a lawsuit from a plaintiff must be frivolous and it must be some opportunistic attempt for the plaintiff lawyer to make money. However, the finance industry and in the insurance industry have realized now that there is money to be made by getting on board with the plaintiff's side. And once that train starts going, you can complain all you want about the impact, but it's going to go. Well, and I'm happy to see it finally, Larry, because there has been so many years where the other side, the defense side, the corporate side, has been so successful in harming the plaintiff's bar that I think the introduction of finance and insurance is really not just our catchphrase of leveling the playing field, it actually is now beginning to truly level the playing field. And they're scared.
They are. We've had a front row seat since we've been involved in that industry. And it's been, we started working on level insurance in 2011, 2010. The growth of that sector, the evolution of that sector, the innovations that have been made, it's blown my mind. And I'm really proud of not just us being early in on that, but I'm proud of this sector as a whole because there's been so much innovation occurring there. But I think that's because that innovation has been so successful, you really see now that there are some interests on the other side that are beginning to get very concerned about the success of the innovations in insurance and finance to facilitate again, that balance that I spoke about earlier. And I think when you talk about social inflation, this term that's, this term of art that, it's more artful than it is a term. I think the people who are writing about this and using and analyzing social inflation are really keying in right now on litigation finance. So let's talk about why does a plaintiff's lawyer need financial assistance in the first place to go against a defendant in that lawsuit? And why does the defendant not need that sort of financial assistance? Why?
That's an obvious rhetorical question of importance.
It's rhetorical to those who perhaps understand it, but I don't think a lot of people have ever paused to say, why does one side need financial assistance while the other does not?
Well, it's a very simple answer. Because the other side has had endless financial assistance since the beginning of this system, while the plaintiff typically has been operating bootstrapped, trying to get the case through the huge corporation that has endless money that will beat them down with costs and expenses to try to limit the recovery for somebody who's otherwise deserving of a recovery.
But let's use the prototypical big company who's being sued. They're not coming out of pocket to defend themselves, right? Exactly. So don't you find it ironic that the insurance companies are actually financing the litigation, but on the other side?
Of course. No, I don't find it funny. It's the ultimate in irony. They are financing all the litigation. They're paying for experts. They're paying for all the travel. They're paying for the depositions. They're financing, tremendous amounts of technology that's being utilized in trials. And their expectation, when you see people writing that it's very bad that there's insurance or financing for the plaintiff, what they're ultimately saying is, we on the defense should have endless resources to crush you but you don't deserve anything. And the mere suggestion that you should have it should make people go up in arms.
Right, because the typical insurance policy, and again, I'm oversimplifying, it's going to pay for the cost of defense to defend the lawsuit, and ultimately it's going to pay some sort of what's called indemnity. So if the defendant is found liable for doing something wrong, again, they're not coming out of pocket. Again, I'm oversimplifying. The insurance policy will kick in, and that will provide whatever award is going to whoever's been harmed.
And by the way, we don't edit these at all. We go off the cuff, and that's why when if you hear fire trucks and ambulances, it's because it's basically as if we're doing this live, and that we prefer it that way, So we do one take and we're done. So we'll let those ambulances and fire trucks do what they're doing.
It adds authenticity, exactly, and perhaps some like cheeky humor about ambulance chasers. I guess you can insert the joke there.
Somebody can insert that joke, but your point. I think your point is exactly right, Larry, and that is, there is a resistance, actually, like, a pure, attempt to end litigation finance. And, there's new disclosure rules in certain states where defense wants the plaintiff to have to disclose if they're getting litigation finance and where they're getting it from. The insurance products themselves, there's an attempt, including with our particular product, to simply end the programs, stop them in their tracks so they can't offer any assistance to the plaintiffs. But I truly feel that we are now in a position where the horse has already left the stable. And it's a good thing, because it's going to be continual attempts to stop litigation finance and litigation insurance. But at this point, it's here to stay. And the people who have been trying to prevent it have to realize what it's like to go against what we have always gone against in our career.
And it's just the same false premises and disingenuous arguments being made over and over again. Right now, they've become focused on litigation finance in all of its forms and insurance now. And we will continue to press against that, not only in what we do and the products and services that we offer personally, but in speaking publicly about these things. Because I think at the end of the day, I also view this as part of our duty and obligation as lawyers. This is our profession. And we're officers of the court. We believe wholeheartedly in what we've always done. And this is just part of what I think we have to be doing, is speaking out publicly against these assaults, ultimately, on our system of justice in the United States, and on the ability, in a very artful, I think very elegant way, of taming bad actors.
And with that, we will end this episode of Trials and Tribulations.
Good to be back.
It is good to be back, and we will continue to try to publish more content. If anybody ever has any questions for us or wants to comment on anything, you can always email us. It's either Justin or Larry at LevelEsq.com. We're always happy to answer any of your questions, and we hope you enjoyed this episode.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us. This episode was sponsored by LevelEsq.